Hello and welcome to Critical Line Item. My name's Tom Ravlic. Thank you for joining me for this particular podcast. Over the past 12 months, we've been hearing a lot about foreign interference in Australia and overseas when it comes to social media and how social media is used by different actors to persuade or attempt to persuade certain audiences um, uh, in ways that are, let's just say, not particularly clear and transparent. In other words, we're noticing that bad actors are using social media to generate or build upon or amplify certain causes. And we've seen this with QAnon in the US. The Soufan Center recently released a report that took a deep dive into the issue of the state of play with the QAnon conspiracy adherents in the United States, what they do, why they do it, and also the fact that their online presence has been infiltrated by various foreign actors, including Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Joining me today to have a conversation about how you find out some of these players join a particular party online and throw things around and trying to manipulate is Leela McClintock. Now, she's a data analyst with a company called Limbik in the United States, and they were part of the exercise the Soufan Center conducted and recently published a report on. Leela, thank you for joining me.
Of course, happy to be here.
And now, before we begin, I tend to like asking guests that may be unfamiliar to my usual audience who they are and what they do. What would your background look like if you put it on an envelope or a post-it note?
Right. So, yeah, as you mentioned, I am a data analyst with Limbik, which is a content science company. And at Limbik, we use artificial intelligence and predictive modeling to identify, quantify, and counter foreign and domestic disinformation more broadly. And in terms of my specific background, I sort of got into this space in a bit of a wraparound way. I'm actually was always interested in languages, actually. So I've studied Italian and Arabic for many years, and I've always been passionate about, understanding what's lost in translation. So in a lot of ways, what I'm doing now is actually linked that we can, I'm sure, go into a little bit later. But yeah, and so along with that, with my interest in languages, specifically Italian, I became very interested in the rise of far right extremism in Italy. And so I ended up participating in numerous sort of research projects in college related to white supremacy extremism and the ways in which far right ties extend transnationally. And now I'm at Limbik and I'm doing similar type of work, but more so from understanding how, disinformation is spread online and the ways in which bad actors, co-opt online spaces to spread disinformation. So that's a little bit about me.
Well, let me just expand upon one area you mentioned. You're particularly interested in Italian, but you mentioned Arabic as well. Have you had to use your Arabic language knowledge in looking at the posts and other things online over time? Uh, because there's been a fair bit of activity in Arabic when it comes to the other side of the terrorism equation, Al Qaeda and ISIS.
Yeah, I actually have, believe it or not. And what's interesting is that I've used Arabic in a lot of ways actually related to far right extremism, which is quite interesting, specifically around election season in the United States. If you know a little bit about, Saudi Arabia and their sort of Twitter apparatus,
Yeah.
frequently, bot accounts, often affiliated with the regime, will post a variety of tweets, typically, praising the regime. But similarly, there were a bunch of perhaps Saudi linked accounts with, profile pictures of Donald Trump or other far-right figures that would then post hashtags like hashtag Make America Great Again or hashtag Stop the Steal. So that was quite interesting because you would have a bunch of tweets in, modern standard Arabic, and then suddenly would transition to these hashtags with these seemingly, bot-like accounts. So I've actually been able to use Arabic a lot in that space, which has been very, very interesting for me.
That's fascinating because when you, for some people, with a name like Ravlic, you probably guess that speaks one of the Slavic languages, being Croatian. Your mind works at different levels when you've got another language that you're fluent in, or more. Let's just segue into the report, and we can talk more about what you found out with your Saudi Arabia. Now, how did the research for this particular report into QAnon conspiracy theorists begin for you?
Right, so that's a really great question. So Limbik started working with the Soufan group a little while ago. So basically, at Limbik, we sort of have two sides to our business. One side is that we work with different media partners and agencies and help them inform their messaging strategies. But then on the more security side of things, our analysis of social media content allows us to inform effective counter messaging strategies for public and private sector clients. So basically, we use our expertise on, the ways in which content resonates with folks to determine how, that content could be manipulated by bad actors and how it could, impact, various private sector companies or different public sector actors. So with the Soufan group that, works with a variety of different clients, we had the opportunity to use our methods of analysis and the ways in which we find weaponized content online. And through that, this work, regarding QAnon was born. We created various sets of queries with QAnon-specific hashtags and keywords to help us flag QAnon-affiliated content. And that sort of, allowed us to notice a variety of different patterns and different things that led us to believe, the ways in which QAnon poses, a grave threat to national security. And we realized the importance of this work, the more and more we worked with the Soufan group and the more and more we learned about the way QAnon spreads, or QAnon conspiracies rather, spread online.
Now, there was a substantial number of posts that you have downloaded and analyzed. How did you get that sample? How did that work?
Yeah, so what we do, a different set of hashtags and queries. We create those queries in a third-party software platform. And through that, we're able to pull the data. And that will often, that gives us lists of, posts upon posts from a variety of different accounts that are all classified as QAnon affiliated. And we also, have a QAnon classification content model from a topic standpoint. So, in that sense, we can understand the ways in which hashtags or different tweets, or sorry, not hashtags or tweets, but the ways in which accounts have hijacked certain hashtags, such as, hashtag when we go one, we go all, or hashtag save the children. Those are very obvious and easy to identify. So when we're looking through our data, we can see, those are surely QAnon affiliated, or those would be classified as QAnon. But then we also have other, types of posts or tweets that we see that are a little more amorphous and, less easy to identify. And so that's when we start to look for, different language patterns or different content style patterns. And something really helpful is, looking at the different comments that have been on certain posts. And so we'll really have to go at a manual sort of granular level, to classify certain types of content. So it's a bit of an inexact science, but it involves, in addition to our automated processes, it involves us really, getting down into the data and understanding what does this say, how might this appeal to someone, and how can we counter it.
Okay, so let's get the process clear here. There are a whole bunch of hashtags and keywords that are used to identify
Yes.
posts between one
Yes.
date and that have been put up between one date and another. But then
Yes.
you've got the overlay of human intervention. So, okay, now that we've got the sample of, I think the number was something like 166,000.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, 166, 167,000. Now that you've got that, you then transpose human intervention to look at what those posts say and how
Yes.
how people interact and respond.
Yes. So, prior to any reporting that we do, the collected posts and volume and interaction data are analyzed and the data sets are checked for any missing data. So that's also how we find different outliers and other anomalies. So we go through, a multi-step process to make sure the data we have is clean and is classified accurately. So yeah.
Okay, now the fun stuff begins when you start to notice things that are not um, let's, for the sake of the argument, call it a Native American post.
Okay.
All right.
Yes.
Yeah, a post that's come from someone who is a QAnon adherent in the US.
Right.
What are the things that you look for that are
Right.
the electronic fingerprint that tell you that a post may originate from somewhere else?
Right. So this is also kind of a multi-pronged process because it is very difficult to classify, content specifically from foreign sources. Classifying domestic, born sources are quite easy. Usually, you're able to tell based on the language present in the posts, the types of hashtags that are used, oftentimes, and oftentimes you can see where, specifically on Facebook, where administrators are located in the world. So that's sort of the first step, determining admin country or location. And this you get via page transparency for certain Facebook pages. And then furthermore, after that, we at Limbik use a proprietary foreign influence classification model to determine the likelihood of foreign influence for pages and groups where we don't have access to the administration country. And our classification model is we use a machine learning clustering technique developed to discover foreign influence activity and most likely country of origin. And through this, we're able to actually quantify post similarity with English language content from known foreign accounts and other sources. So anytime we don't know the location of a certain post or account, we compare that to the accounts we already know through different AI techniques, essentially. And so, and oftentimes as well, we have to take a manual approach as well, just to, make sure we're covering all our bases and make sure there are no anomalies in our decision or in the data as well. So there's always a margin of error in this type of work, but we're very confident in, the likelihood of our tools to classify foreign or non, for lack of a better term, foreign content or domestic content rather.
Okay, but in the case of, say, posts from Russia, what are the things that you found? What gave the what were the giveaway signs of the posts that you found that were coming from the Russian side of the equation?
Right. So for Russia, for example, we already know, that state-backed Russian sources, for example, RT News, will often use certain captions or headlines or content that does seem explicitly conspiratorial or QAnon related in nature. And often, when you look at the comments of the people who are looking at those posts, you'll have people spreading different QAnon conspiracies or posting QAnon style memes. And with Russia specifically, for accounts that we aren't necessarily state backed or look a little bit different, the way we look at that is just trying to understand the type of language they use, the type of content they produce. Something really frequent that we observe is the use of memes. Certain targeted memes that could evidently appeal to a US related viewer or a Western viewer, and the type of language that's used in those memes. Similarly, we've noticed the same usage of QAnon hashtags, and that's what makes classifying foreign content so difficult, is because a lot of it can look the same, and that's the point, right? The point is to appeal to a certain segment of the US population, and the point is to mimic the ways in which domestic accounts post QAnon content. So, in combination with what we know, about previously known Russian, backed accounts, through our foreign classification model and the way we've trained it through natural language processing, we're able to, using that, have a high level of confidence in that which we're looking at is from a Russian source.
Did you notice in your analysis when you're looking at, say, the Russian originated Facebook content and the Chinese originated Facebook content, that the Chinese content was mimicking the Russian content, or were there things that were different about what was coming from Beijing?
Yeah, we noticed a lot of similarities, and I know that we touch on this in the report. How Beijing has not only expanded its disinformation apparatus, but has mimicked, the Kremlin in the way that it spreads disinformation, specifically in the ways in which they sort of infringe upon these polarizing fault lines in American society. And that often can be, a dead giveaway, that these countries are trying to interfere in American society or American politics. So we definitely notice similarities. And I think, through our data and realizing that, China does have an apparent prominence in disseminating these conspiracies, I think we can understand that even though, the groups disseminate similar types of content from both China and Russia, social media platforms are certainly not as well versed in, classifying campaigns of Chinese origin versus those from Russia. So, although there are similarities, I do think because only recently has, Beijing begun to sort of play a more active role in this space, it's more difficult to classify their content.
You also talk about the way in the report there's a bit of a conversation that takes place about Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Right.
And when you hear about Russia and China, I think most people understand that they've got propaganda arms that deal with these things online and elsewhere. What peculiarities do you notice in the Iranian post? Is there anything that was different in that you identified?
Yeah, I think the main difference that I noticed, I find that specifically Iranian and Saudi accounts primarily come from Twitter. So, although there is surely content present on Facebook as well, I think specifically the ways in which Saudi and Iranian accounts create these kind of bot-like identities by using a fake profile picture can often be, a giveaway that they're coming from those accounts versus a Russia or a China. Similarly, I've also noticed certain hashtags pop up more so with Saudi and Iranian accounts versus Chinese and Russian accounts. And in addition, another pattern that we notice more generally, for inauthentic behavior online that's quite specific to China and Russia, is sort of this clustering of accounts that will often post the same types of information at exactly the same time. And this is a very, peculiar happening. in which certain accounts that are special interest focused, like, for example, a group of accounts with Chinese admin that are kind of lifestyle content, will
Yeah.
suddenly one day, post something about human trafficking at the US Mexico border. And then there will be a series of comments saying, save the children, or the Democrats are trafficking children. Despite these accounts seemingly having this lifestyle oriented nature. And I've noticed that a lot more so with China and Russia than in Saudi Arabia, where I find the kind of the overt or QAnonness, for lack of a better word, is just more easy to identify. And so a lot of these accounts have kind of a lot of various little complexities that we kind of need to take into account whenever we're doing this type of research.
You mentioned earlier that you uh, had a number of languages, and Italian and Arabic were two of the languages that you've mastered, learned. Um, how easy is it to deal with the online content in Arabic? Well, how did that play out for you when you were working on this particular project?
Yeah, I mean, Arabic is complicated. Obviously, there are a lot of different dialects and manners of speaking, but typically just using my own knowledge of the language, specifically what's often hard to tell in certain posts is the use of sarcasm. Can be very difficult, specifically when you're reading Arabic language posts. But interestingly, what we're primarily focused on is trying to understand how these accounts that are seemingly Arabic language will post in English, right? If you have an account with a Saudi administrator that typically posts only in Arabic, and then suddenly they'll post something that says hashtag make America great again, I'm voting for Trump. It seems a little off, right? So although I've used my Arabic, in this work and in trying to understand some of the stuff, that's said in Arabic online and whether it's affiliated with QAnon, what's typically more likely to be affiliated with QAnon are posts in English. And that sort of indicates to us that, these actors are targeting an English speaking audience. And I think that's kind of the key takeaway, that they want to weaponize and co-opt these conspiracies in order to sow further societal discord and to assert some other kind of political agenda. So there's that complexity in there as well.
Now, clearly the work didn't just involve looking at foreign influence, because there's only about a fifth of the posts that you analysed
Right.
were the sample that provided the evidence for Russian, Chinese, Iranian, and Saudi Arabian um, dabbling or meddling, if I can put it that way.
Right. Yes.
Um, but what did you learn from the rest of the material about the behavior of people that are QAnon adherents? What were the findings there?
Yeah. So, I think as we asserted in the report and as we've been asserting, obviously QAnon is a domestic movement. It has roots, in US history, often very, xenophobic, anti-Semitic roots. So, a lot of the complexity of QAnon, of the QAnon movement more generally, is that it's very hard to classify adherence because at this point, frankly, probably due to the politicization of the QAnon movement, the ways in which QAnon has kind of become mainstream in American life, we're finding that QAnon adherents can range from anti-vaxxers or anti-abortion activists, or far-right extremists, right? And so QAnon has sort of become intertwined with these various other concerning actors and movements in and of themselves. And because QAnon, is kind of a set of conspiracies, somebody might believe in one QAnon conspiracy, but not another. And so, the interesting thing about looking at specifically domestic accounts or QAnon adherent accounts. Well, oftentimes, you'll find a Telegram channel, for example, that explicitly says, Q, when we go one, we go all. We know that's a QAnon account. But then maybe we'll see another account that says human trafficking or, sorry, end human trafficking or save the children. And we'll see, classic sort of QAnon affiliated content in that, right? Like different hashtags that have been co opted by the movement, like Save the Children. But then other times they might be completely different and might speak about a different topic. So it's hard to kind of classify and put QAnon in one category because it's so widespread now. And there are so many different, tentacles attached to QAnon, specifically when thinking about the ways in which bad actors have co-opted the conspiracy as well in order to draw new followers in.
The salad bowl effect that QAnon has is interesting
Right.
to observe. And you're right; it's difficult to classify. Does that complicate data analysis for you when you're looking at it raw?
I mean, it definitely makes our work harder in that we have to really sit down and make sure that everything we're looking at is QAnon related. And I found that, it's become increasingly harder the more widespread and globalized QAnon becomes and the more and more people sort of get involved in the movement. And I think that's sort of the danger of QAnon in and of itself, is that it is difficult to classify and it's difficult to tackle, at a federal government level because, even people you might assume, right, or groups you might assume, might not revert to those conspiracies. We see the ways in which they kind of become intertwined, with different types of folks. And I think we saw that as well, at the insurrection on January 6th. And so I think it also just makes our work even more important, as we continue to refine our methodologies and refine our classification models, to make sure that we're bringing in, all applicable content and that we're monitoring all of the content necessary.
Which brings me to the next question, because reports like this are a snapshot in time
Hmm.
in terms of intelligence gathering. How much of the process of getting the data is automated so that you come back to looking at it at a point in time to review where things are at, to review what the level of interference from China is as opposed to Russia, as opposed to Saudi Arabia, as opposed to Iran, or as opposed to any other player that may emerge?
Right. So most of the process is automated, but as I mentioned earlier, we do have to go in manually and make sure that there are no anomalies in the data or no incorrect, accounts or posts that we've included in that. So it is this, kind of more complex, a little bit of a painstaking process, sometimes at the artifact level, as we're looking through all of these different posts, in order to make sure that that which we're including is accurate and that it's explicitly affiliated with QAnon, or that we can say with confidence that this is from a Russian source or from a Chinese source, right? So I don't know if that answers your question completely, but
Eh,
it definitely requires sort of a multi-pronged approach.
How many of you then get involved in it? Because 166,000 posts, um, harvested and then analyzed, uh, doesn't I imagine doesn't just involve Leela McClintock sitting there looking at
No,
every single one of them.
no, definitely not. I mean, we worked, with, our other personnel at Limbik to help us with this. And, obviously, the folks at the Soufan Center were actively involved in the process as well. And we all had access to the data, so we could all look at it and making sure that we were analyzing everything effectively. So it definitely required a lot of personnel, and this research project was a few months in the making. So it a lot of long hours and late nights, but I think we all feel very happy with what we've been able to produce and show.
It's fairly comprehensive. Are you? Can we expect a follow-up based on the report that has been released on QAnon, given that there are some early indications that you have in the QAnon report that the dynamics have been shifting in the overseas influence, in the overseas interference. It looks like from what's been reported that there's grounds for an update at some stage.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure. I hope so. I think, especially now, QAnon is such a hot button topic. But in addition, I think we've seen, and I know I've seen it in Australia, the ways in which QAnon has sort of taken root in different countries and kind of adapted to the different sort of circumstances in different countries, which is frightening to see. And I do think now that the federal government in the U.S. is kind of taking this threat more seriously. I believe the FBI director remains concerned about the conspiracy and is hoping to release a new report on it. I know we definitely at Limbik as well as at the Soufan Center definitely want to keep involved in this space and we continue to flag and analyze the data as it comes in for our different clients. So I don't think this process will end, and I hope we get to provide some updates.
Now, you mentioned Australia there briefly. What are the things you've noticed in Australia? Is there anything particular in the data that you saw, or is that more of a general observation about the environment?
I think, from my end, it was more of a general observation. I mean, I've certainly seen, if, for example, if I will do, a search for a specific QAnon hashtag, I have noticed that a lot of, accounts that are seemingly Australian will, post QAnon affiliated content with those same hashtags, often saying things like, the Democratic Party is, filled with pedophiles, right? But then at the same time, I think there's also been, some analysis done. I think I was reading an article about this earlier about how, QAnon in the various countries it's taken root in is not just talking about the US, right? It's spreading conspiracies about its own country. Right. So there might still be a human trafficking ring, but it might not be among the Democratic Party, but rather the Australian equivalent. So I think that's interesting to keep in mind that, and important to keep in mind that the movement is adaptable and that people, it's no longer a domestic threat anymore. QAnon has sort of reached, countries all over the world at this point. And I think that was one of our main takeaways from this report as well. It's, a transnational threat as well.
One of the things that I, as a journalist and to someone who's dabbled in or taught rather audit and assurance, interested in is letting the evidence speak for itself. And you, as a data analyst, should be
Right.
familiar with that.
Right.
Not everybody has um, the training and the knowledge to be able to look at information the way you and I might.
Right.
What are the things that you would recommend people keep in mind when they're looking at social media and other things to sort of inoculate themselves from um, some of the kind of material that you've observed in doing your research? Um, is there any thing that you could say to a listener about how to approach the material on social media?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question, and something that I think about a lot, actually. And I think the concerning thing about, conspiracy theories more generally, and, clearly QAnon conspiracies, is not everybody, believing in these conspiracies is a malintentioned person, right? I mean, for example, Save the Children. So many people actually think they're saving the children, by spreading these conspiracy theories. And so, what I think, this might be more so a recommendation for folks at the government level to realize that community-centered and offline solutions are necessary to counter this digital epidemic, if you will. I think that digital literacy is a huge problem in the United States, but all over the world as well. And I think, not only encouraging people to, take a class on, information or the way information is conveyed online, but even more so, I think we need to think more deeply about the systemic barriers that are put in place for people and, why, people will, fall to conspiracy theories or conspiratorial beliefs. I think there's a broader question, in the ways in which certain communities believe what they believe in, because of inherent mistrust in the government and inherent mistrust in the people that are supposed to be protecting us. So I think it raises, further questions about how we can encourage people to maybe, talk to their friends and family and see if they can, find someone that might help them, understand that these conspiracies can be dangerous. Although I will say it's difficult, and I think it's difficult to change someone's belief system. But I do believe that, if big tech companies and, government entities can, provide the tools for people to learn more about how to be safe online, I think we'd all be the better for it.
What role do you think the media has in helping people understand what they're seeing and how what they're seeing needs to be questioned and they need to be skeptical about?
I think, I've seen a lot of different media entities sort of release different, reports or, fact sheets on, myth versus fact, right? This is fact or this is a myth, et cetera, et cetera. But I think it's, harder than that, especially, you can't really prevent someone from believing anything, right? So, and, the media in general, news outlets need to understand that, they need to be careful, I think, in the types of headlines that they use and the types of, wording that they use in what they put out, because it can easily be, manipulated or co-opted by somebody who could either be malintentioned or somebody who already has these conspiratorial beliefs. So I think the media just needs to tread more carefully and think about, how they might affect a vulnerable or susceptible person to these conspiracies. And similarly, sort of stray away from the sensationalism in some other sense as well. So again, a complex question, but I think we all need to put some thought into, the ways in which we craft what we put online, because what's online stays online forever, and you never know who's going to see it, right? So.
And Leela, it's been fascinating talking with you and exploring the way in which the recent report was done, and I'm sure people will be particularly fascinated by this as they listen, and I'll probably go to the report and look at it with a set of fresh eyes. So thank you for joining me today.
Of course, it was a pleasure. It was a great chat.
And I hope we can have a chance to talk again in due course.
Yes, definitely. Would love that.